Hello students, welcome. This is Dr. Mercado speaking. I hope all of you are doing well and we are excited to get started with Chapter 2, which deals with computing wages and salaries. Unlike the prior chapter, Chapter 1, in Chapter 2 we are going to have a lot of calculations. So we're going to begin to calculate regular and overtime pay, as well as identify distinctive compensation plans, and also be able to describe the main types of records used to collect the payroll data, and of course define hours worked. So there's a lot of information covered in this chapter. Make sure that we read it before we attempt your assignments. I cannot emphasize that enough. Okay. If at any point in time you have any questions when you're completing your weekly assignments, do not hesitate to reach out to me. Just make sure that you include the problem number that you're working on. If you can send me an image or a screenshot, because every student has a different problem. That way I can see what your problem is, your attempted solution, and your specific question or questions. I will review them and provide you a response and some guidance. Okay, I'm not just going to simply give you the answer. I want to provide guidance and show you where you can go back and refer to it. And maybe you're just missing a step here or there. But I'm more than willing to help. Be very careful on your rounding. A lot of students miscalculate because of rounding issues. Remember, if it's 1 to 4, you keep the number. If you look at the third digit and the third digit is between a 1 and a 4, you keep the second digit. If the third digit is a 5 or greater, then the second digit is increased by 1. So students have some issues with rounding, and that causes some minor miscalculations and ultimately causing you to get the problem incorrect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead in this particular lecture. I'm not going to talk about any of the content per se of the chapter. I'm going to let you all read that on your own. I am going to dive into the actual problem solving of these two exercises. Okay, so the first exercise we have is exercise 2-4A. So it says the wages and hours information for 5 employees of McNeese Enterprises for the week ended July the 7th. Employees work a standard 40-hour work week and are paid time and a half for all hours over 40 in each work week. Okay. For each employee, we are being asked to compute the regular earnings, the overtime rate, the overtime earnings, and the total gross earnings. Okay. Compute the total gross earnings for all employees. Okay. And then they give you a little layout. Okay, so what I did over here is I basically copied the information from the little table provided into the actual Excel document so I can type in. Okay. So now we have these 5 employees we have to calculate the gross earnings for. Okay. So remember, employees get paid 40 hours a week. That is the normal work week. Anything above 40 hours is considered overtime. Okay. So let's look at the first employee. And it's Carmen, not Kaman. It's Carmen. Okay, so let's look at Carmen. Carmen worked 47 hours. Carmen gets paid at a rate of $12.45. So now we have to calculate the regular earnings. Well, let's get the calculator out. So we know that Carmen gets paid $12.45 an hour. And we know that the regular earnings are based on a 40-hour work week. So we're going to multiply by 40 hours. And that's going to give me $498. Okay. So what we did is we got the 40 hours times the 12.45. Okay. You know what? Let me just put a little notation here. Okay. That way we know how we calculated. And I'm just going to do this one for the first one, okay? So the regular earnings were 40 hours times the 12.45. And that gave me the 498, okay? And these are Carmen calculations, okay? That way we know how we got the numbers for Carmen. And then you can just follow along for the rest, okay? Now we have the overtime rate, okay? Now for the overtime rate, we're going to get the regular hourly rate, which is 12.45, and we're going to multiply by 1.5. Okay, and let's see, because the overtime rate is 1.5 times the regular rate. So it's 12.45 times 1.5. That gives me 18.675. Now let's 18.675. 18.675. Now that needs to be rounded, okay, to 2 decimal places, okay? So we're going to be rounding. We're going to look at that third digit. That third digit is a 5, so that means that we're going to be rounding to $18.68 an hour. 18.68. So remember, you look at the third digit. If it's between 1 to 4, you keep it as a 7. If it's 5 or greater, you make that an 8, which is what we did here. So my overtime rate is 18.68. Okay. Now we're going to do our overtime earnings. Okay. So for my overtime earnings, I'm going to have my overtime rate of 18.68, and I'm going to multiply that by my overtime hours. Well, I had 40 hours that are regular. That means I have 7 hours that are overtime. 7 overtime hours. And then let's see what that gives us. So it's 18.68 times 7 hours overtime. That gives me 130.76. Okay. Okay. And then your total gross earnings is going to be your regular earnings of $498 plus your overtime earnings of $130.76. And let's see what that gives us. So that's $498 plus $130.76. That gives me $628.76. Okay. So I went step by step for Carmen. That way you could see each of the calculations, how they're done. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing for the rest, but I'm not going to go as much, and I'm not going to be typing out each of the calculations. The calculations are the same. I'm just going to be speaking as I go. Okay. So for Galasso, I've got a regular pay of $11.90, and I'm going to multiply that by 40 hours. That gives me $476. My overtime rate is $11.90, and I'm going to multiply that by 1.5. That gives me $17.85 of my overtime rate. So it's $11.90 times 1.5 gives me $17.85. My overtime earnings is my overtime rate times my number of overtime hours. I have 2 hours of overtime. That gives me $35.70. And your total gross earnings is going to be your regular earnings plus your overtime earnings. That gives me $511.70. Okay. Now let's do Jones. Jones gets paid $10.85. And you see, I'm using Excel because it just allows me to click the cells and do the math within my actual worksheet. If you all feel comfortable using Excel, that's fabulous. It's going to cut down your calculation time in more than half, okay, instead of using the calculator. And a lot of the times when we use a regular calculator, we might punch the wrong number or make a mistake. I personally prefer to use Excel because I've got my information laid out and it's just a matter of selecting the cells, okay? So, Jones, regular earnings is going to be the regular pay, and I'm going to multiply that by 40 hours. That's going to give me $434. Let me format this. Okay. Okay. My overtime rate is going to be your regular rate times 1.5. That gives me $16.28. Your overtime earnings, you're going to get your overtime rate times your number of overtime hours, and you have 48 hours. 40 are regular, 8 are overtime. So that's going to give me 130. Okay, so now here it's 16.28, and then it's how many hours? 8. It's 130.24. Okay, and now my gross earnings is going to be your 434 plus your 130.24. That's 564.24. Okay, so we're going to just complete doing the same thing for the next two employees. We're going to multiply that times 40 hours. My overtime rate is going to be the 11.25 times the 1.5. Okay, and remember we have to round, so that's going to be 16.88. Okay, your overtime earnings is going to be your 16.88, and we've got 4 hours of overtime. That'll be 67.52. And then your gross is going to be your overtime earnings plus your regular. Okay. Now, when you're doing calculations here, for example, this one right here on your overtime rate, okay, it's you can do equal, round. That way, it rounds the calculation for you. So the overtime rate will be that times 1.5, and then if you click here, it's thinking. It's gonna take you. Let me see. I don't know. It's now loading. It just opened a whole bunch of windows for me. What happened? Okay, right here. So it's asking you to round. How many digits do you want to round? I want to round to 2 digits. Okay. You see, so it'll round it from 16.875. You're telling the system round it to 2 digits. It'll round it to 1688. If you don't do that, equals round, then it'll keep the number as the 3 digits, and then your overtime earnings calculation will be off. So if you are using Excel, make sure that you always use the round feature, okay? Okay, so the regular earnings for Willman, it's going to be the 1340 times 40 hours, okay? Your overtime rate, I'm going to do equals, and I'm going to do the round. And I'm going to do the 1340 times the 1.5. And then I'm going to do, I'm going to click over here on the formula bar, and I'm going to say, well, I want you to round it to 2 decimals. And then it'll do that. Okay, it'll round it for you. And then your overtime earnings will be your overtime rate times the number of overtime hours. And here we have 5.5 overtime hours. That will give you 110.55. Your gross is going to be your overtime plus your regular. That will be 646.55. Okay. And then once you're done, you just add the total gross earnings for all of your employees. And that would give you 2868.77 cents. Okay. So the calculations for Carmen are described here in detail. Okay, remember your regular is always the rate times 40 hours. Your overtime rate will always be your regular rate times 1.5. Your overtime earnings will always be your overtime rate times the number of hours over 40. And then your total gross earnings will be your regular earnings plus your overtime earnings. Okay, so that is the first exercise that we're covering. Remember, if you have questions or get lost, do not be shy. Communicate with me. I'm here to help you out as much as I can. Okay. So here we jump into the next exercise in this lecture. This is exercise 2-6A. It says Connie Duffy started working for Dexter Company on Thursday of this week. She worked 9 hours on Thursday and 8 hours on Friday. Her annual salary is $80,000 and she is an exempt white-collar employee. Determine her gross pay for her first partial week of work. Okay. Now, before we even dive into this problem, make sure that you read the information on the book. There's a lot of information. So here I've highlighted some information about exempt employees because this is an exempt employee. It says she's an exempt white-collar employee. So exempt employees are those workers exempt from some or all of the FLSA requirements such as minimum wage, equal pay, and overtime pay. Now, what is a white collar? Okay, this is a white collar employee. The FLSA exempts some workers, such as executives, administrators, professional employees, or highly compensated employees, computer professionals, and outside salesperson from the minimum wage and overtime pay provisions if they satisfy certain tests. And then the textbook provides you some of the test information. So it says to be eligible for this exemption, the employee must be paid on a salary basis, must be paid at least $684 per week or $35,568 annually, and must meet the primary duty requirements as listed on figure 2.2. So I've included the figure. So here we have the executive titles, anybody that fits the executive ranks, which their primary duties are managing, supervising people, and they have the authority to hire, fire, or promote. We've got the administrative. These are primary duties performing of office work and regularly uses discretion and independent judgment. We have the professional category. Work requires advanced knowledge, knowledge acquired by prolonged course of instruction. We have business owners. They own at least 20% of equity of the business and they actively manage the business operation. If you are a highly compensated employee that earns more than $107,432, performs non-manual work, and regularly performs one of the exempt duties of an executive, professional, or administrative employee. We've got our computer professionals. We've got our creative professionals. This requires invention, imagination, originality, or talent in an artistic or creative endeavor. And outside salespeople. So if you fall under any of these categories, you can classify as being a white collar employee. And a lot of times they frame it for you really beautiful. They're, okay, we're going to pay you a salary of so much. But then that means that you're no longer going to be getting paid overtime. That's going to be your salary, whether you work 5 hours, 10 hours, or 15 hours a day. Okay? So you just have to be really careful with this. Okay? Some of these people are labeled white collar workers, and make sure that you fit the test of exemption to be able to be labeled one of those individuals. Okay, so this is just a little bit about the background behind the exempt white collar employee. Now let's get to the calculation. Okay, so it says here that Connie makes $80,000 a year. Okay. I am going to divide that by 52 weeks. That's the number of weeks in a year. Okay. So we've got 80,000 and I'm going to divide it by 52 weeks. That's going to give me 1,538.461. So let's look at that third digit. Is that third digit lower than a 5? Yes, it is. So then that means I'm going to keep it at 1538.46. Okay. So it will be 1538.46, and then I'm going to divide that. How many number of days did she work that week? Well, it says here that she worked on Thursday 9 hours and on Friday 8 hours. So she worked 2 out of 5 days. And I really don't care the number of hours that she worked. Why? Because she's exempt. So she can work as many hours as she wants, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20. It doesn't really matter. I know that she worked 2 days. So I'm going to pay her for 2 out of 5 days. Okay. So I'm going to get the 1538.46 and I'm going to multiply it by 2 over 5. And that's going to give me $615 with 38 cents. Okay. Now remember, look at that third digit. If it's between a 1 and a 4, then you keep that second digit as is. If the third digit is a 5 or greater, then you need to make that second digit a 9. In this case, it's a 4, so I'm going to keep it at 615.38. Okay, 615.38. So, how much am I going to pay this employee for those 2 days that she worked? Well, we're going to pay Connie for those 2 days, for Thursday and Friday, $615.38. So let's recap. You're going to get the annual salary divided by the number of weeks in a year, which is 52, and that's going to give you your weekly pay. Once you get your weekly pay, you're going to multiply by the number of days that she worked that week. She worked 2 out of 5 days, so that means we're going to pay her $615.38. Okay? So that is the second exercise that I'm going to be covering in this video tutorial. Please read. This is a lot of calculations that we're going to be working on. You cannot learn payroll. You cannot learn accounting by listening to me. You have to actually do problem solving. Okay, put your hands on into the application of the problems. Make sure that you review a lot of the exercises and examples provided on your book, so you can be able to complete these problems. Okay. So that is basically it for this lecture. I'll be recording another lecture to cover some additional problems. But until next time, have a great day.